I'll introduce myself quickly. My name is Emma, and I'm the Sexual Assault Response and Prevention Coordinator, or the UQ Respect Coordinator, a bit easier to remember. And I'm actually based in Student Services over at St Lucia campus, but as part of my role, I run sort of a range of staff development trainings on these types of topics around sexual assault prevention and response, as well as sort of being an ethical bystander. My background's in health promotion, and so I guess my sort of primary focus is looking at those kind of that primary prevention stuff. So how do we actually prevent these types of things from happening? Before I get started, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting today, and whichever land that you're sitting on today. For us, it's the Jagera and also the Turrbal people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today. We'll cover today, we're going to look at a few different things. We're going to start off looking at being an ethical bystander and what that means. We're going to sort of structure the content around sexual assault and sexual harassment prevention, like I talked about, but bearing in mind that a lot of the strategies that we're going to learn and talk about are really applicable kind of across the board to all forms of kind of, you know, when we see something that is a bit off, or other forms of bullying and harassment. So that's hopefully kind of important. And then we'll spend a bit of time at the end as well looking at what respect in supervisory relationships look like. I guess it's always just nice to remember to look after yourself during these sessions. We might be touching on a few sensitive topics. Like I said, we'll be talking about things associated with sexual assault and sexual harassment. So just, you know, taking some time out if you need to, checking in with each other, and you're welcome to check in with me if you need to. And there's a few, I'll put a few details up at the end around just kind of supports if you do find you need to talk to someone after the session for any reason, but mostly just looking after yourself as over the next hour. I think that's it for housekeeping. So like I said, we're going to be focusing on being an ethical bystander. So everyone's got an idea of what a bystander is, yeah? So a bystander is someone who just witnesses an event. So you can be standing by a river, and just by the nature of being there, you see someone drowning, and just by being there, you're sort of a bystander. You can be a passive bystander, which is to do nothing. You can be an active bystander, which is to jump in the water and try to save them, or just to do something. We like to talk about ethical bystanders. So ethical bystanders are active. They do something in that moment. They attempt to influence the situation in a positive manner, but they consider their own safety and well-being, as well as taking a moment to consider the consequences of their actions. So it's just adding those two kind of extra kind of thought process or layers along with those actions. So I think it's nice to always just start off thinking about a time when yourself or someone else that you know has intervened in a situation. So often we'll kind of do this as a group situation, but I might just give you a minute just to maybe reflect on this for yourself rather than try to have a group discussion. But we will do some scenarios as we move on. We'll try to figure that out on Zoom as well. But just thinking for a second about a time either when you or someone else spoke out in a situation. It doesn't have to be related to the topic that we're thinking about today. Can be related to sort of, anything that was going on. But just thinking about what was happening at the time in that situation. What do you think allowed that person the opportunity to intervene? And what barriers may have been present for others in the situation? So I'll just reflect on that for a minute. Feel free to maybe raise your hand in Zoom if you would like to share your experience. Might be a little bit tricky as a Zoom meeting, but I'll just give you a minute to quickly do that, and then we'll kind of get into the crux of our information. Okay, so we'll push through. So that's just designed to kind of get our brains in the kind of thinking about this topic and thinking about, you know, times when we have been a bystander or not. As I mentioned, we're talking about sexual assault and sexual harassment. So we use the term sexual misconduct because that's, I guess, the policy term that we use at UQ. And I'll just put up the definition of what that means, of what from our policy perspective. So sexual misconduct is any unwelcome behaviour of a sexual nature that's committed without consent or by force, intimidation, coercion and manipulation. And it's, I guess, kind of an inclusive term. So it includes behaviour that might amount to sexual assault and or sexual harassment. And I guess the key thing that's just important to kind of think about and reflect on with that definition is really the kind of unwelcome nature of it. So it's not always about intent. It's actually about whether it was unwelcome. Does anyone have any questions about that definition? Please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat if you're comfortable to, and Aideen can read it out. So we won't spend too much time on this, but I guess it's good to just think about the problem. These statistics come from a student survey that was conducted in 2017. The data was collected in 2016, and all universities across Australia participated. And this was from the student perspective only, so it doesn't include staff. But it really showed that both sexual assault and sexual harassment are key issues for our student communities in universities across Australia. Like I said, we don't have the same sort of survey for staff, but the Human Rights Commission has just done the Respect at Work survey, which looked at respect in workplaces across Australia, including tertiary education. So there's a little bit more updated information and statistics there if you are interested. But I guess just to say that it is a kind of a key issue that we all need to be sort of aware of and working towards preventing and supporting people who have experienced this. So the impacts, I think we're all probably quite across this, but it's nice I think it's important just to kind of highlight there's the sort of personal impacts around violations of safety and rights and those sorts of things, but there's also organisational impacts. So you're looking at, decreases of productivity, damage to team relationships, all those types of things across an institution. And the Lancet in 2018 just sort of showed us that sexual harassment is most likely to occur in environments where that behaviour is perceived to be tolerated. And I think that's just important to highlight as we're talking more about being ethical bystanders and how we can actually be working to sort of change those kind of cultural things, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Any questions of those? Good. Okay. So before we dive in, I think understanding prevention. So obviously, when something does happen, we really want to be able to support someone who does experience sexual assault or sexual harassment. And that's a really important thing. And we're going to spend a bit of time on how we can do that if someone does tell us about an experience at the end. But ideally, we'd like to be actually preventing this stuff from happening in the first place. And so a useful way to think about it is this triangle. And so if we really want to be addressing this stuff and stopping it from happening, we need to be actually looking at the cultural norms, attitudes and beliefs, as well as those associated behaviours. And if we can be working sort of at these lower parts of the triangle, we're going to be really making a difference at that top part of the triangle. Does everyone know what I mean by cultural norms, attitudes and beliefs? Does anyone just want to put an example maybe in the chat of a cultural norm, attitude or belief that we might be talking about when we're thinking of prevention of sexual assault and sexual harassment? Any ideas? Feel free to speak up. Yes. Christianity. In what way? Yeah, okay, so different, I mean, definitely there's different kind of cultural beliefs across, different cultures and different religions. And sometimes some of those, can perpetuate sort of inequalities between men and women or different ways of treating people, which could be true, sort of, I guess, across the board. Yep. Any others?
We've got Nico online who said, hugs and kisses accepted in some cultures for greeting, but certainly not in many.
Yeah, that's a really, really important one. And again, sort of touches on those cultural differences. Yep, that's right. So great. Any others?
Vanessa says, dressing codes vary across cultures.
Dressing codes as well. Yep. Any others? Not so far. I think we're sort of starting to touch on them. So we're talking about, yeah, things like inequalities between different genders is a really important one. Attitudes around sort of victim blaming can be a really important one. And beliefs around sort of strict gender roles around what it means to be sort of a man or what it means to be a woman. All these types of things can sort of, they create an environment where sexual assault and sexual harassment can sometimes go unchallenged or be perceived as acceptable. It's also really important to think at that lower level around the interconnectedness of sort of other forms of discrimination and harassment. So we're thinking, thinking about sort of racism and homophobia and those types of things. We see sort of from the statistics that there are key groups that experience significantly higher rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment. Women sort of experience, I think it's the ABS sort of showed us that about 1 in 5 women will experience sexual assault or sexual harassment, whereas about 1 in 22 men. But also sort of gender and sexually diverse folk, as well as people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, as well as people with a disability. And what that kind of shows us is that we really need to be addressing those broad kind of forms of discrimination and harassment if we're going to be stopping sort of the incidents sort of at the top end of the triangle. So it's important to be keeping those types of things in our minds when we're thinking about being an ethical bystander. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Does that sort of make sense? Do people have questions about that? Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky if it's the first time you've sort of thought about it. Good. So when we're going to thinking about being an ethical bystander, I just want to touch on power, because we often think about power as kind of coercive control, power over someone. But there's other types of power too. We have, or power two is our first type of power, and that's everyone's power to act, right? So that's everyone's ability to be able to take action and to be able to do something. And sometimes we can use our power to help other people sort of hone or build on their power too. And we also have power with. And power with is sort of that collective power, the power we get from working together as a team on an issue. So very quickly, we're going to do a quick activity, and you can just put in the chat as you're going which type of power these quick scenarios are about. So the first one, so remember we've got power over, power to, and power with. So a group of students notice that sexual violence is an issue among their peers. They collectively decide to address the issue, writing articles around bystander actions in a short magazine, arranging a guest speaker to present at student conferences, and encouraging peers to support survivors. Power over, power to, or power with? We've got a with in-house, got a lot of withs. Beautiful. Great. A clinical supervisor arranges a dinner meeting at their house with a student to discuss their progression. Power over, power to, power with?
We've got power over online.
Power over? Yeah, I'd say power over. And finally, during a case-based learning session, a tutor observes that a student is uncomfortable as another student continues to sit close to them, be in all of their working groups, follows them closely out of class. The tutor talks to that student who is uncomfortable after the session, asks them if they're okay, and tells them about the SMSU and the possibility of changing classes, if necessary. Power to, power with, power over? Power to?
Yeah, lots of twos online.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Perfect. I should also just mention, you probably can't see on chat, but I'm quite pregnant, so I'm a little bit breathless, which is why I'm losing my breath. Just a little disclaimer there. So we're thinking about being an ethical bystander. There's more or less kind of 4 stages of intervention, or 4 things that an ethical bystander needs to do in order to be able to take action. So the first thing is to notice the event, and secondly, interpret it as a problem. So sometimes that can be quite obvious if you're, seeing a kind of overtly harmful situation. But I think what we need to be doing sort of as a community and as a society is really starting to kind of acknowledge some of those bottom level parts of the triangle that we were talking about as a problem. So thinking again here about, those more subtle kind of cultural norms and attitudes that might underpin some of this behavior. So thinking maybe a little bit about, sexist or racist jokes, derogatory comments, those types of things that sometimes we don't immediately interpret as a problem. But if we as bystanders can start to sort of do that and start intervening there, we're going to start seeing some real shifts in terms of incidents, which is really important. The third step is to feel responsible. Has everyone heard of the bystander effect before? Yeah. Great. Everyone online? Okay. So the bystander effect is basically a social phenomenon where you have multiple people watching something happen, and it kind of diffuses a sense of responsibility. So because there's lots of people there, no one feels like it's their job to actually do anything. There's a whole range of research, largely in psychology, around the bystander effect. But I guess the important thing to remember is that the moment that one person does something, they often kind of create a new acceptable social group, and many other people kind of who also notice that it was a problem jump on board and end up, sort of working with that person or also doing something. So it's just something to keep in mind when you do, if and when you do kind of hear or see something, just being mindful of that, and if that's happening, and that you might, just by doing a small action, you'll be encouraging other people to jump on board as well. And there's a quote there by someone who was Australian of the Year and a Chief of the Army, David Morrison, who said, "The standard we walk past is the standard that we accept," which I think is just sort of quite a powerful statement around that. And then finally, we need to process how to take action, which I think is where most of us sort of often get stuck. We think our minds kind of go directly to kind of confrontational action, which has a lot of barriers associated with it. So we're going to spend the next few minutes sort of unpacking some other things that we can maybe do that are not necessarily confrontational. Any questions around that? Everyone's okay online? Okay. So we like to present the 5 Ds model. So the 5 Ds are basically designed to, I guess, increase our repertoire of responses. So give us a few more ideas around what we can do when we're seeing or hearing something that we think is a bit off or that we think is wrong, but we're not really sure how to react. Having a few different options in our minds can be really helpful. So the first D is to distract. And distracting is really about changing the trajectory of a situation or of a moment. It's not about actually directly confronting a person or sort of even confronting the situation. It's really just about shifting the focus and changing the trajectory so that that doesn't continue, whatever it is. So something like maybe accidentally dropping your phone or asking a question of the person that's being inappropriate can really just kind of shift things in the moment. And sometimes that's the sort of safest and easiest thing that you can do. There's a couple of, I won't play them now, but I will make sure we get all the slides out to everyone. And there's a couple of video examples down in the corner, which you're welcome to watch in your own time. The second D is to delegate. So again, sometimes the safest thing to do is to just ask someone else to intervene. And that might be someone else in the sort of within the faculty, if that's where we are, or of course security or police if we're talking about sort of an overtly dangerous situation. So delegating can sometimes be the best thing that we can do in a moment. The third D is that direct action. And I think this is kind of often where our minds go in the beginning, but like I said, there are many barriers which we'll unpack a little bit in a moment around why people find direct action so difficult. But if it is safe to do so, You can directly confront the person, telling them that their behaviour is not okay, or helping the person, sort of the target or the person experiencing the harassment or the whatever's happening, can help them move away as well. The fourth D is delay, and I think this is one that sometimes we don't think about and we kind of forget that this is a really important thing to do. So this is about checking in with the person after the event and offering support, and sometimes just letting them know that, you know, you saw what happened and that it wasn't okay can be a really supportive and meaningful thing to do, and then supporting them in whatever way they need to. So delaying can be really important. And then our final D is to document. So sometimes, documenting the event afterwards can be really important. At UQ, you can do this, but you can do an anonymous or a third-party report if you want to. I'll put the details at the end of the slides on where and how you can do that. That's just a really important way to kind of let the institution that you're working in know what's been happening and what is going on. So third-party and anonymous reports can't always be sort of directly kind of addressed or investigated, but they're really important because they kind of create a body of knowledge around how we're going in our community and what some of the issues are, which influences, you know, the education campaigns that we do and different sessions like this one. So that can be a really important thing to do. Again, in whatever institutions that you might be working in or that your students might have placements in, you know, documenting things, if they have the processes for that, can be a really important bystander action. So there are 5 Ds. Any questions on the 5 Ds? To put them into practice a little bit, or safety first, always important to look after your safety first. We're going to, I think Aidene's going to break you up into breakout groups if possible. And we're just going to have a look at a couple of scenarios. So there's 3 scenarios that we've put in the chat. So if each group wants to pick one scenario, so if we can have 3 breakout rooms, we just want to read the scenario together as a team and then have a bit of a discussion around these 3 points. So have to think about the 5D model and what could happen in that situation. Think about, would you intervene? And if so, how might you intervene? And then also just think about what are the potential barriers to intervening. Yeah? Maybe 5 minutes should probably be long enough. Right. Great. Yeah. Can you guys, sorry, I just sent a message in chat. So it says, so if you're going to chat function, when you guys are breaking one, so if you take scenario 1 at the top, you see that
All right, it's only us anyway.
Yeah, do we have a scenario? I can't see anything.
I don't think you have a scenario, and even in the main room, I think I'm in the main room right now.
Yeah, I think I'm back.
I can still only see you, all of you who, so
I took my
Yeah, I
camera.
quit because everything froze, so I don't know what was going on.
yeah, but even though we're in the main room, we're still in our breakout room, or the other way around. I guess
Yeah.
everybody else is gone. I think that's
We
the
all
problem.
left, yeah.
No, you're not.
Oh,
We don't have a scenario to talk about.
Neither do we, so that's why I came back. But
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, well, they've got a scenario in the room, so that's fine.
so should we go back to the room, aren't you?
I don't think we can.
I think if you're on the bottom, the second button from the right says join breakout room, so we can just go back.
Yeah, but there's no point if there's nothing to discuss.
I can't.
Yeah, if there's nothing to discuss, then that makes it difficult, right?
Yeah.
He's gone back anyway.
I think that's a stress test.
Can people on Zoom hear me? Maybe not.
Yes, I can.
Yes, yes, we can.
Wrap up.
Oh, yes, we can.
Is everyone back with us?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for all participating. I know breakout rooms can be a little bit tricky and awkward, and sorry I wasn't able to jump in and just have a little listen to the discussions. We won't, I guess, spend too much time sharing, but does someone from breakout room 1 just want to make a quick comment around their scenario? Do you feel like unmuting and having just reflecting on maybe some of the Ds that you discussed?
So that was our group, right? So Peter and Melissa and Gabrielle and I. So one of the things people acknowledged was the cultural norms and how much they influence people's responses, and how one's ability to recognize it might be slightly different depending on the country that you're in at the time, expectations, but realizing how delay was definitely one that came up very often.
Yep, absolutely. That's a really important point. I think people's actual sort of, abilities to recognize what is happening in that moment, and certainly delaying in this situation is one thing that pretty much all of us can do. It's quite a safe intervention, and just making sure everything's okay. So yep, great one. Quick comment on scenario 2, which was us. Oh, we did this one as well, but there were some people in the breakout rooms. Did you want to mention, it's Phil, right? I don't know if you talk loudly, people on Zoom can maybe hear you. Do you want to just say like maybe one of the Ds that we thought would be useful in this scenario? Yeah, yep. So just so everyone could hear that one. So if you were kind of on an equal level and you felt able, just directly intervening and having a chat with the primary supervisor could be one strategy here, as well as potentially delegating either to HR or to someone else in the team. We kind of unpacked nearly all the Ds in this situation, which was quite useful. Does anyone from group 2 want to comment? No pressure. Okay. And the final scenario, just being in the lunchroom, does someone from group 3, can someone just comment, maybe just one of the Ds you thought would be good? We don't need to spend too much time. Anything popping up in the chat, or anyone want to say something?
I think I kind of stuffed up the availability of the scenario, so I don't know how many people actually got to discuss it.
Okay, no worries.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Anyway,
we were,
no worries at all. I think
I think we were group 3 and we didn't have a scenario, so we just discussed the fact that if you don't stop something at the time, then that person can carry on with their behaviour and do something worse later.
So thanks so much, Fiona. Sorry that Emma can't hear you here, but Fiona was just saying that they all talked about the importance of the fact that if you didn't do something, that person might carry on and repeat that behavior again in the future, not recognizing the inappropriate nature of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Fiona. That's a really great point. Beautiful, thank you. And I appreciate all your participation. Sorry, it was a little bit clunky, but I really appreciate it. So just want to touch a little bit before we kind of move into sort of talking in depth around supervisory relationships and what respect kind of looks like in that context. Thinking a little bit about the barriers to intervening, because there are a whole lot of barriers to being an ethical bystander. So on a personal level, we all have personal barriers. Someone's physicality, so the actual size, can be sort of a barrier, but also their social position, either at work or in a peer group, and that's something that we discussed here in the room around whether you actually have the, what your work position would kind of dictate what kind of intervention you'd be able to take. Your own personal attitudes, which again was sort of touched on, people's ability to actually recognise something as an issue or not, as well as your perceptions of whether that's actually going to be and you're going to be effective as a bystander, really affects whether people do anything or not. Also just personality. So who likes conflict? Anyone? You know, that's a completely valid thing, and many of us don't. Many of us shy away from conflict, and that's absolutely okay. What we hope is that the 5 Ds has kind of given us a few extra ideas, kind of, again, increase that sort of repertoire of responses of things that we might be able to do within, within our own comfort zones, which is important. So barriers at a relationship level, relationships with a perpetrator or with the target can really affect what you can do as a bystander, or what you feel comfortable to do, as well as the attitudes and norms of your peers or colleagues. So again, that's thinking about, those cultural norms and attitudes, and sometimes that can, hinder whether we're able to do something or not. At an organisational level, workplace supports and systems really make a big impact. And that's also whether an institution is sort of set up to take complaints or set up to be able to delegate to someone, as well as social and career risks, which we talked about a little bit here in the room as well. And then finally at a societal kind of level, which we sort of discussed a little bit earlier. So they're kind of, I guess I think it's useful to have the barriers in our minds, and hopefully that the 5 Ds have kind of, they don't take away the barriers, but they give us kind of little ways around them, or little different ideas that we can do to sort of get over some of these in different contexts. Is there any questions around that, or does anyone want to kind of comment around being a bystander? All good? I'm not going to go through this now, but again, we'll send you the slides, and there's some really nice videos that are done by an organisation called Our Watch here that give you some other kind of ideas around things to do when you're noticing, particularly those kind of cultural norms, attitudes and beliefs when they come up in social situations. So that can be a really useful website if you want to delve into this a little bit more. So we're just going to spend, have we got 15 minutes or 20? 15? 15, okay. We'll try to get through as much of this as we can. I just want to, so we're going to spend a little bit of time now on what respect in supervisory relationships means and what's it look like. I'd love to just get, if you're willing to just maybe put in the chat just a couple of words around what this means to you. So what does respect in these kind of research supervisory relationships mean for us? A couple of ideas, either unmute yourself and chat or put in the chat. Yeah. No, I probably. I think if I go out of it here, do you need your prompts? No. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you. So what do people think? What does respect mean? Do you have any ideas, Phil? Yeah, so communication and really listening. It's a really great one we've had here in the room. Yeah, there's another one in the chat, having boundaries. That is so, so important. Absolutely. Feeling comfortable and open to discuss. Really good. Again, maintaining those professional boundaries. And that's something we're going to look at in a scenario in a minute that I think is probably one of the most important things. Any other last comments? I just wanted to put up, was there one there? No. I just wanted to put up for you, this is sort of Universities Australia's kind of principles that they've come up with. They've developed a bunch of resources, and we're going to watch one of the videos from their resources around respectful supervisory relationships. And this is what they sort of talk about as the 8 sort of underpinning principles. So that's around sexual and romantic relationships really not being appropriate within that type of a relationship. That universities recognise that this power imbalance and that the greater power imbalance does rest with a supervisor, which was something that we talked about here and people that did scenario 2 may have touched on. Again, like we've had in the comments, which is really important, that professional relationship needs to be characterised by that mutual trust and respect. Did that go off? That safeguards are put in place for students to be able to protect them, and that's really a reflection of acknowledging those power imbalances, and then that we do need some sort of safeguards there, as well as the safety and well-being of anyone who does report sexual assault or sexual harassment is really important, and that disclosures and formal reports are met with support and compassion. So those are kind of the sort of underpinning principles that Universities Australia has come up with. And I thought it might just be useful for us, is that changing? No. To have a little bit of a look at our policies and codes of conduct that kind of relate to this. So this is kind of in our context here at UQ. So at UQ, we've got the sexual misconduct policy and procedures. This is a relatively new policy. It was implemented in 2017, sort of as a result or sort of out of that national survey that I talked about at the beginning. The sexual misconduct policy really just outlines that all survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment at UQ can access, just move this, I'm sorry, can access support and what we call reasonable measures, which is around academic adjustments or workplace adjustments, you know, emergency support, counselling, all of those types of things. And then it sets out how to make a report or a disclosure. The second one that's quite relevant for us in this context is our code of conduct. So our code of conduct talks about, you know, not abusing positions of power, and particularly that personal and sexual relationships between a student and a supervisor may create this a potential for an abuse of power and can damage the other individual. And the code of conduct also specifically highlights sort of bullying and harassment is not acceptable. The third one, just to mention, is our conflict of interest policy. And our conflict of interest policy does highlight that everyone must avoid conflicts of interest, including sexual relationships, and that if you become aware of a sexual relationship between someone who sort of has influence over the other person, so that might be a supervisor and student, or it could be a manager, someone under them, that they do need to be disclosed. And then from the student side, we have the student charter, which also talks about, you know, just zero tolerance towards harassment and bullying and discrimination, those types of things. So the links to all of those are there. I'm sure most of us are aware of all of these policies, but I think it's just important to refresh ourselves and remember that we have them. Any questions on those? Particularly the first one might be one people are not as aware of. Yes. Yes, that's a really great point. So Adine is just highlighting that the sexual misconduct policy really lays out the fact that the incident doesn't have to be related to UQ in any way. And so support and reasonable measures will be provided for anyone who has experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment at any stage in their life and in any context. And also there's no sort of time limit on reporting these things as well, which is really important. Yeah. Anything else? Got the chat up now, so, okay. What we might do is we're going to watch a quick video, and as I talked about, these were developed by the Australian Council of Graduate Research with Universities Australia. There's a whole series of videos, and they unpack some of these really challenging dynamics around relationships specifically within research supervision that I think we've all probably sort of experienced to a degree, and they unpack some of the more challenging ones. So we'll watch the video, and then I've got a few questions that we'll go through together at the end. Can I hear?
So how have you been getting on?
I'm settling in okay, but I'm still finding weekends are a bit tough. Big city, everyone's got their own mates.
It'll take time, but it will happen. Look, if you like, we could have these meetings at my place. It'll save you the commute. It is a bit more homely.
Hey.
Oh, you look nice. Is that new? Oh, that colour really suits you. Come in. Come on. Tea, coffee, wine.
No, tea will be fine.
Sure. But if you're going to live in Melbourne, you really have to start drinking coffee. Those are the rules.
Do you live here alone?
Oh, no. I'm married. But Jenny's a pilot, so she travels internationally a lot. This is where I can work in peace, away from the undergrads. Oh, the serenity. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, you shouldn't have. Thank you. You're very sweet.
Have you thought about the Canberra trip?
I'm not sure. It's a lot of money.
Well, my wife suggested an Airbnb. They're about half the cost of a hotel. And I can tell you now, once you learn the National Archive system, your research is going to skyrocket.
My supervisor's been fantastic to me. We meet at his place and he's been very helpful with my research. He even got me a birthday cake. My PhD's going great. We're going to Canberra to the National Archives.
Wow, he's really putting in. My supervisor couldn't give a rat's.
And he's even getting cheaper accommodation in Canberra for us.
How so?
He's getting an Airbnb.
Your supervisor? Does he live with anyone? Girlfriend, wife?
Yeah, wife. But I've not met her. She's never home. Pilot.
So she's never there?
No.
Okay, so hopefully everyone could hear the scenario. Initial reactions? First things. First, yeah, OMG. Hopefully. We like to think, you know, some of that stuff was pretty overt, but I mean, I guess the reason that these videos were developed is because you'd be surprised how often these types of behaviors do happen. But yes. So I think, I mean, the first question is, you know, pretty obvious. So what might the reasons be for the candidate's friends being concerned, and are these concerns justified? What do people think? OMG makes us think yes, they're probably justified. Any other thoughts? Yeah, so we've had here in the room that you really shouldn't kind of mix that home and work context or relationship. But also a really important point is how tricky that has now become with COVID, you know, with a lot of us being at home a lot of the times. And that's kind of an extra layer of things we do need to consider, super important. Has the supervisor crossed the boundaries for the norms? I think, are most people agreeing? Yep. Yeah. Got a few yeses. So what could the supervisor then do to ensure that that relationship with the candidate remains professional? And just thinking around, you know, given the power imbalance, but also given the candidate's need to learn essential research skills, the risk to the PhD relationship, if the relationships break, if the relationship breaks down, but also given the limited project funding. So what does the supervisor need to do in this situation? If you'd like to unmute yourself and just make a comment, that might be easier than you know, typing a big response. Feel free to do that. Any suggestions? There's a few maybe, you know, I guess some of the more obvious ones are kind of making sure that there's someone else there at meetings if they do have to happen not on campus, could be one idea. You know, figuring out a way to, you know, make that accommodation situation safe. I'm sure there are other avenues you could go down rather than just booking an Airbnb for the two of you. Any others? Yeah, so we've had in the room, it's a really important one, delegate to other people to, you know, take on different roles for that student and to be there for that student, really important one. And this is a really key point. So Nicholas says it might be too late, but as it looks like the student is not concerned, or at least less concerned than her mate. And that's a really important point, and that's something that we actually spoke briefly about here in the room in the scenarios around, you know, consent in a relationship where a power imbalance is really inherent, and whether that consent can actually ever be there given the really significant power imbalance within a relationship. So that's a really important one. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So very quickly, do we think our reaction would have been different if the supervisor and the candidate were the same gender? What do people think? Just a quick yes, no. A no from Vanessa. Yep. No. Few no's. I do agree, and I think this is something that I think it's important to bear in mind, because often particularly when we're being bystanders, sometimes we're not as alert, you know, when things are happening between people of the same gender, but we probably, you know, should be, and we, you know, grooming and sexual assault and sexual harassment does happen to all of us in a whole range of, not all of us, all people in a whole range of contexts and situations. So we do always want to be, you know, if something seems not right, we always want to be checking in, sort of regardless of someone's gender. Is it ever okay to schedule meetings at a supervisor's home? What do people think? We've got a couple of head shakes here in the room. I would agree. And I mean, as we've talked about potentially at COVID, you know, in this situation, things are going to change. But hopefully there's always somewhere else, you know, there should always be, you know, a public space, if not a workspace, that can be figured out. And just finally, as the secondary supervisor, would you say anything to the principal supervisor about putting themselves in that situation? What do people think? We've got a head nod. We've got a few yeses. Yeah, so I think that's a great sign. I think it's really, I think, yeah, definitely would be an important thing to do. But again, you know, figuring out what you can say and how you can say it, depending on your relationship with that person, you know, in the workplace context. Beautiful. Anyone want to say anything else about that scenario? Last comments? It's quite an obvious sort of one, but does bring up some of those kind of the challenging things and unfortunately some of the things that we do see sort of in universities across the world, really. Okay, so we've got another scenario there that you can look at in your own time. I just want to spend 2 minutes before we wrap up just talking very quickly around what you can say if someone does tell you about an experience of sexual assault or sexual harassment. This might come up, not necessarily, you know, in the context of, you know, potentially someone needing an extension or, you know, some kind of other support. So it's really important that we all just know some of those very basic tips around what to say if someone does disclose an experience to us. So the first thing we always need to do is to listen. And that's to say things like, I'm sorry this happened to you. And remembering that there's no need to ask questions at that point. No need to interrogate. All we need to do is hear that person. And the second thing to do is to say, just to support them. And that might sound something like, this is not your fault. Does anyone just want to comment on why that's so important? Saying something like, this is not your fault? Anyone have any ideas? Yeah, that's right. So we've had here in the room that self-blame can be a really a big thing for a survivor. So that's just a really important thing. And then just referring on, again, being mindful of boundaries, which we talked about earlier, just making sure that person has access to the support and know what's available to them. So at UQ, we have the Sexual Misconduct Support Unit, which I think there are a range of different supports, but I think just remembering that they exist as the one sort of point of call is really important. So I've put their contact details up there. And there's a range of other support services there that are available as well. Remembering that the SMSU are a unit of counsellors that have expertise and training specifically in complex trauma and working with people around sexual assault and sexual harassment. So they're a really, really valuable resource for our community here at UQ. And then I've put a couple of the staff support services there as well. So we're just over 1 o'clock. Does anyone want to ask any last questions? Just before, oh, sorry, Adi, did you? Good. We will wrap up then. I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to join me, and thank you for your patience with the Zoom meeting. I didn't actually expect it to be a Zoom meeting, so that was great. Thank you for your participation. My contact details are here at the end of the slides, which we will get to you, and also the UQ Respect website. So just respect.uq.edu.au has all of this information that we all talked about and a whole lot more. So that's a really good resource to remember as well. Have a great afternoon and thank you.